All right, let's talk about the Cold War in Asia. Japan, once a bitter enemy of the United States due to the attack at Pearl Harbor, Japan became closely tied to the U.S. defense system. We actually became the pretty good allies with them and still are today. We patched things up pretty well. Post World War II, Japan was solely under the control of the United States. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the reconstruction of Japan, and several Japanese military leaders were executed for war crimes that they had committed during that time. They were set up in a parliamentary democracy, with the emperor being more of a ceremonial leader than an actual one, kind of similar to what they have with the King and Queen of England. War had to be renounced as a national policy, and Japan was given very little military capabilities. As a result, Japan really truly relied on the U.S. for protection. Think about this. The guy that wanted to invade Japan and just absolutely destroy them, is now their governor. And they actually had a pretty good relationship. There's a couple pictures of, I think there might be some in your history book, of Emperor Hirohito and Douglas MacArthur next to each other. Douglas MacArthur looks like a giant compared to that guy. It's funny. But America and Japan became pretty close, even though the tension was really, really bad during World War II. By 1951, the U.S. ended its formal occupation of Japan. However, the U.S. was still able to keep military bases there. In China, Chiang Kai-shek had been in power since the 1920s. His nationalist party was in control during World War II, and they received massive aid from the U.S. to prevent a Japanese takeover. So we became pretty good friends with him. He kind of relied on us, but we kind of needed him because we didn't want Japan to take them over. As the war ended, there was a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist power and Mao Zedong's communist power. You might see Mao Zedong's name written Mao, M-A-O, and then T-S-E-T-U-N-G. But this is pretty much the common way that Americans would see his name. The nationalists were losing people by the droves due to inflation and corruption, and the communists were appealing to the poor, landless peasants. Again, they tend to follow dictators tend to follow poor lands. America tried to intervene, but after ruling out an invasion of China, Truman decided to give $400 million in aid to help them out. However, about 75% of those supplies ended up in the hands of the communists due to the corruption and the collapse of the nationalists. By 1949, mainland Japan was controlled by the communists. The nationalists had retreated to an island called Formosa, also known as modern-day Taiwan. From there, Chiang Kai-shek still claimed to be the legitimate ruler of China, even though he really probably wasn't. However, this is the big deal. I would highlight this. From this point until 1979, the U.S. refused to recognize Mao's regime, and China had become communists. Back home, many accused Truman of losing China to the communists, and in 1950, the Soviets and Chinese signed a pact. This furthers the Red Scare paranoia back home, because now you have two massive, massive nations that are now communist, and your policy with communism is containment, and it didn't work. So that takes us to the Korean War. After the defeat of Japan, its former colony, Korea, was divided along the 30th parallel by the victors. The Soviet armies occupied the Korean territory north of that line, and the U.S. forces occupied the territory in the south. By the time both armies left, North was controlled by Kim Il-sung, which is the family that is still in possession of North Korea, and the South was controlled by Syngman Rhee. By 1950, the North Korean army surprised everyone by invading South Korea. Truman reacted immediately, and the UN authorized a military action. He called it a police action. He did not call it a war, so that he did not have to go to Congress for approval, and he helped defend South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur, who's already over there, was put in charge of troops of this action by the UN, though this force was mainly made up of U.S. troops. Now, why are we even worried about Korea? Well, again, what is our policy with dealing with communism and spreading? I'll give you a second to answer out loud. Yes, correct, Jonah. It's containment. And we don't want it to spread. The theory is if it doesn't spread, it will die out. Well, it's starting to spread, and now it's starting to go into areas, and now they're trying to take North Korea communist and make South Korea communist as well. And at the outset of the war, the North Koreans had pushed the South Koreans, At the outset of the war, the North Koreans had pushed the South Koreans and the Americans to the tip of South Korea, basically the southeastern corner. However, MacArthur made a brilliant maneuver by launching a large amphibious attack on Incheon, which is behind the North Korean line near the border of the North and South Korea. And the UN troops moved further north towards the China border. So basically, think of it like this: they pushed us all the way down to the south. We decided to split them in the middle, and we pushed them all the way back to the north, almost to the Chinese border. China had warned the UN that if they would defend their land if they felt threatened. By the end of 1950, the Chinese had crossed the border into North Korea and had swarmed the UN troops. This becomes a big deal because now all of a sudden you're looking at possibly World War III. MacArthur had stabilized things basically at the 38th parallel, so the North Koreans are on their side, South Koreans are on their side, but he had requested from Truman and the UN that he be allowed to extend the war by bombing China and sending in more troops to invade China. When Truman denied the suggestion, MacArthur went to the media. Truman had warned him against this, and MacArthur had appealed to the masses. As a result, with the support of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. MacArthur should have known better. He's a military guy through and through. The guy that is in charge giving commands shouldn't be questioned, let alone in the media. And when he did this, he pretty much knew he was going to be fired, but wanted to make sure he did not agree. He felt like we were becoming very soft on communism. That was a term that they used frequently with Truman, that he was soft on communism and that he was not as intense, and he lost China. Anyway, MacArthur returned home as a hero. People loved him. You got to think World War II war hero, rebuilding Japan. A lot of people thought he was wonderful. Most Americans loved him, and his no substitute for victory stance, his no substitute for victory, that was a common phrase that he used. The stance was over the president's containment policy. Critics of Truman crushed him on this move for basically not allowing a guy to go after these communist nations. But again, what is Truman thinking here? Give you a second to answer. Correct, Wyatt. Truman doesn't want to go into World War III. If he goes in and he invades China, who's the neighbor that's going to go in and invade us? Russia. We don't want to go down that road. Fighting hit a stalemate at the 38th parallel. Peace talks had begun as early as 1951, but it wasn't until 1953, under President Eisenhower, that an armistice was finally signed. The Korean War, it should be war, sorry about that. The Korean War cost around 55,000 American lives, and over 2.5 million died during that war. Now, that's not our side, we're talking total. This is often referred to as the Forgotten War, mainly because it's tucked in behind World War II and in front of Vietnam. And you guys probably know more people that fought in the Korean War than you do the World War II era, because that's probably closer to your grandparents' age, I would guess. But nonetheless, it was a war. The aftermath of the Korean War was seen in a different way. Supporters of Truman were quick to point out that his containment policy had worked. North stayed where it was at, and it stayed communistic, and South stayed where it was at, and it stayed more democratic. And Truman had asked Congress for the authority to send in troops to more areas worldwide and create more jets that could drop a massive amount of bombs. And again, Congress is a little bit nervous about this, just because we're kind of thinking like, man, if we go down this road, it's never going to stop. Critics of Truman were not as kind to him. His loss, and that should be in quotes probably, his loss of China and lack of being able to destroy communists in North Korea led many to declare him soft on communism. Truth be told, both views were probably somewhat true. I would, again, make sure you associate him with being soft on communism, as that was a very, very common thing for him to be associated with. Now, we're going to have to go backwards just a little bit, and I'm going to go through this stuff, but I want to kind of spend a time on just this point, and I just don't think we have enough time in this video lecture to cover all of this thoroughly. So we're going to stop here, shorter lecture today. Don't forget about your worksheets. We'll talk about those, or I'll post that stuff on your Google Classroom wall, and eventually, guys, I promise we will get to some tests and quizzes here coming up. All right? Let me know if you have any questions. Have a good afternoon.